It's going down, and you're invited for what they selling. We ain't buying. There is no running, there is no hiding. There's only fighting or dying. It's going down, and you're invited for what they selling. We ain't buying. There is no running, there is no hiding. There's only fighting or dying.
It's Going Down is a digital community center from anarchist, anti-fascist, autonomous, anti-capitalist, and anti-colonial movements. Our mission is to provide an autonomous and resilient platform to publicize and promote revolutionary theory and action.
Go to itsgoingdown.org for daily updates. Check out our online store for ways to donate, and rate and follow us on iTunes if you like this podcast.
I'm Spencer Sunshine. I've been watching and writing about counter-organizing against the far right for over 15 years now, and it's always a pleasure to be on IGD.
Awesome. Well, thank you for coming back on. Excited to talk to you. There's obviously a lot happening in the world, from the convoy protests to the fallout of January 6th to everything else going on. So it's kind of nice to hear your thoughts on this. So just out of the gate, what are your thoughts on what's going on in Ottawa right now?
I'm very nervous about it. It is, especially since they've said they want to, I believe they started to blockade the bridge to the United States. It's clearly a very successful tactic. It's clear they have deep pockets behind them. So this is you shouldn't dismiss it as astroturfed, because there's clearly, grassroots force behind it, but that tied into like deep pocketed far right money is a really kind of dangerous combination. The left never gets this on our side. So, if it's successful, and as any activist knows, successful strategy tends to replicate itself. People elsewhere see it and try to replicate it for their own organizing, and it's clearly about to, make an attempt in the U.S. and elsewhere. So I think people should watch this very carefully and make plans to counter it now.
For those that have been reading It's Going Down, we have a column that comes out about every week about stuff in Canada, and some of the biggest stories just in the past couple months have, of course, been the fierce resistance on Wet'suwet'en territory against the Coastal GasLink pipeline. And also we've seen this massive struggle erupt around people blockading the logging of old-growth forest in British Columbia. And, the Canadian state has just gone all out in arresting folks. So, when we literally see them blocking the entrance to the border, and in some instances they're saying they're actually disrupting supply chains and stuff like that. How would you explain that they are, or why they're using such kid gloves with this stuff, and that they haven't cracked down? Obviously we know that they interact with the far right much differently than they do grassroots movements from below and to the left.
Well, I don't know enough about Canadian politics to answer that. It's dangerous to take a U.S. experience and see Canada as being the same. Clearly here, though, we did see, and you see it in many countries, a kind of either collusion or just simply refusal to enforce laws against the far right. And so it does seem to be that's what's going on there. It's hard not to come to that conclusion. It must be harder to deal with trucks. I'm going to be really honest when I think about that. I don't think that's something police departments are usually trained in doing. How do you stop a truck convoy? Obviously, in other countries, this is a more common tactic. I believe in Latin America, it's a more common tactic. So I'm sure there's countermeasures for it. But this is sort of, for whatever reason, I think this is a problem around the world where governments tend to give a lot more, leniency to the far right than the radical left. So this is always one of the things that I think needs to be pushed for, is to try to get a neutral hand in having security services, deal with different political factions in the same way. This has long been a problem for the radical left in the U.S., as we've seen with, for example, the green scare terrorism enhancements. There's a clear emphasis on the radical left as they did that.
It seems like the convoy protests in Canada, sort of like the free speech rallies that happened in early 2017 leading up to Charlottesville, have kind of branded themselves around these like broad things like freedom and, trying to center the working class truckers and all this stuff. I'm curious, if these things come to the U.S., do you think they'll kind of use the same branding?
Well, I mean, in Charlottesville, they did brand it as Defense of the Confederate Monuments, but the organizers were clearly fascists. So here, I mean, I think the anti-vax stuff has been a good sell. It can be a broad tent for the far right and even people with somewhat different politics, famously liberal yoga moms or whatever. And so I think that's a good, if I was on their team, that would be a good way to go. That has proven to be a successful way to go. It's seen as much more legitimate, especially when you're protesting against mask mandates. You're moving even away, because sometimes we just say anti-vaxxers, but there's a bunch of different things in there, and the people don't always agree. Like, some people are against mask mandates are totally like, yes, COVID is a problem. Yes, it kills people. We just don't want to be forced to wear masks. So there's a bunch of different opinions and takes in there. But I mean, this is something that's very, in a way acceptable, and it probably should be. We don't want to stop people from protesting against, what the health authorities say. That would be, the AIDS movement showed us that, like, sometimes you absolutely have to do that. So it is a very, I think, useful way for a useful ruse for the far right. In the U.S., their other big issue right now is, of course, January 6th stuff. But that's them beating up the bushes of their own supporters. That's not something that's going to be appeal to people outside of their circles. And for many people who saw January 6th as an anti-democratic action that was attempting, to install an authoritarian dictator, it's something that they're deeply opposed to, in a way that people aren't opposed to protests against mask mandates.
How do you think that people can or should respond if they come to the U.S.? Because, I mean, in Canada right now, I mean, it's kind of early to say, but we've seen a variety of different things everywhere. Everything from people doing sort of like mutual aid projects in Ottawa to help folks. And also there's been like blockades of convoys in different cities. What do you think some ideas could be for the U.S.?
Yeah, I think people should try to physically, blockade the convoys or make it very clear that they're not wanted. The convoys are blockading stuff. I think turnabout is quite fair game. I'm sort of disappointed in Ottawa. There hasn't been a big demonstration against them. That seems to be easy enough to organize in Canada in theory. Although I've heard some really, unfortunate stuff about discussions over this inside the left in Canada. I'd like to see a lot of community-based resistance to this, and often that seems to be very lacking in the United States against the far right in general.
Well, we're talking about like anti-maskers and anti-mandate protests and the anti-vaccine movement. How big has this been for the far right in the U.S.? It seems like this has kind of been the crucible that's kind of like held them together since January 6th. Would you say it's been like the biggest kind of current in the far right, like that's kind of brought people together?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And if you think back, it was the first far right, everything kind of shut down with the first wave of COVID, and it hadn't become the anti-vax, anti-mask thing hadn't become a right-wing issue yet. And so the first demonstrations were really like the reopened demonstrations against, businesses and schools and everything being closed. The Bundys were involved with this and stuff. And that was sort of, I believe, before Black Lives Matter, which sort of usurped it. So this has long become a far-right issue. It's long-standing. Certainly in the last year or so, it's become their most popular issue. And it's a, popular organizing tool for the far-right around the world. In Germany, it's much less, it's sort of even more disturbing. It's a combination of far-right groups with, liberal kind of groups in a whole weird mixed bag. It's very popular in Australia. There's really, really crazy stuff going on in Australia. There in particular, it's mixed in with sovereign citizen stuff. The sovereign stuff is getting involved in anti-mask, anti-vax stuff all over the world, I think, but definitely in Australia, and people are becoming very aggressive on both a group and individual level. As people might know, sovereign citizens have a reputation of shooting it out with police and others in an unhelpful way. And so, yeah, this has become a problem around the world, and the groups feed off of each other. Of course, you see a success in one country and you try to copy it somewhere else.
How did we get to this point where anti-vaccines have become like this big thing within the far right? This is something somebody was asking me the other day, and I didn't really have a good synopsis. I mean, I know that there's been resistance to vaccines for a while. Like anti-vaxxer has been a thing since before even Trump, I guess. But how did this kind of like get caught up in MAGA world?
So I think that there's two strains that came together. The first is there's been amongst holistic, medicine circles, there has long been an anti-vaccine current. I remember in the 90s when my friends were like in massage school, and they taught other holistic medicines. There was tons of, I think, a much more moderate, but still like, opposition to vaccines. It wasn't a conspiracy theory or anything. But whether the science behind, I can't remember all their arguments, but I'm pretty sure there was some pretty dodgy science behind it. So that sort of current, was some of the first organizers for anti-COVID vaccine stuff, right? Because you already had people opposing vaccines. The other thing is on the far right, they believe all these kooky ideas that aren't related to politics. I mean, I think people know this with neo-Nazis. They have all kinds of weird myths about, Atlantis and like where Aryans are from Tibet when aliens came down and inserted their DNA, or they have all kinds of kooky ideas. And some of this is they have a deep interest in, holistic medicine and even organic farming. A lot of organic farming was promoted by the original Nazi Party. You'll see this stuff, seen it for decades and decades in the more moderate parts of the far right, like the militia movement. Think about Alex Jones selling supplements all the time. Some of this has to do with their, the Civil War is coming and we're going to hide out in the survivalist thing. And so these ideas have been kicking around for a really long time in both white nationalist and militia-esque circles. And I think the two currents, ended up combining together, that the anti-vax stuff coming out of the holistic medicine movement moved right, just the way that we've seen a lot of kind of odd people be drawn to the far right via Trump specifically, who otherwise weren't in the far right, maybe had woozy left, liberal or even left-leaning ideas in a really woolly way. Get drawn into the far right. I always think of the guy who was singing for the Misfits, not Glenn Danzig, who became a Proud Boy, right? You see like parts of the punk rock scene going into that. So I think, there's long-standing, crackpot, semi-crackpot, popularity of crackpot, medicine in the far right is combining with people who are already doing, activism against vaccines. And then that has been picked up with the greater, just like opposition to, as somehow public health measures got coded as left wing. These all kind of became a perfect storm of stuff running together. With Trump sort of facilitating this, even though clearly he himself, he's vaccinated and there's no evidence he believes these things, but he has plays to his base and sort of helped facilitate them while he was in power.
Yeah, it seems there's been a really weird kind of back and forth with Trump. He's kind of like put his toe in there a couple times and pushed back against Candace Owens during an interview. And then they seem to have kind of like gone back and just pushed back against going back on that. It seems like they've just doubled down on sort of a vaccine pessimism and anti-lockdown politic. It seems like they can't escape that.
It's what the base wants, and you can't stand in front of the base if you want to keep your popularity, or not directly, right? You can't denounce it. Maybe you can keep your mouth shut, but So, I mean, the whole Trumpist thing, which has been surprising in the amount of energy it's been able to keep up with him out of power, is like a mob. It's not, it's a mob based on like untrue ideas. And so I think that's much more difficult to engage with than a movement based on analysis and, a kind of just, when the left picks targets, there's discussion, sometimes endless discussion about it. But that can be engaged with versus this just like emotionally driven, outrage machine with a mob mentality, which is what the Trumpists seem to be.
Like, as you mentioned, the history of, ACT UP, which, famously, dropped banners that said like the CDC kills and stuff. And, this is actually during a time when Anthony Fauci was working.
Yeah, they were at odds with Fauci at the beginning. I mean, he came around
for
later,
sure.
So
for sure. I'm just curious, people have said like, we don't want to like cede ground to the right and like allow them to appear as sort of like these anti-authoritarian, people pushing back against, state repression. I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer to this. I can tell you there's been a change. I mean, for people with who've gotten involved in politics more recently or don't pay so much attention, don't have such a historical view. I mean, I think until 10 years ago, if you said in the United States, if you said an activist, it was automatically understood as a left-wing or whatever activist, right? People were very hesitant even to call right-wingers activists at all. So that's how much things have changed. The right in the U.S. never had this aggressive, or not for many, many years, this sort of aggressive grassroots mobilization in the streets. When they did have a grassroots base, it was these meetings, often of older people. The Nazis called their meetings in the 80s and 90s meet, eat, and retreat. In a disparaging way. The skinheads did, I guess, because they were trying to create something different, but that movement was very small. And so this is really a new thing, really, from the Trumpist thing, that you get, large and aggressive demonstrations of right-wingers in the streets. Obviously, it's sort of rebellious now and wants to be authoritarian later. There's a long history of that from different political movements. The Nazi Party was even kind of like that. They recruited young people being like, here's a place you can get in street fights and smoke cigarettes and hang out with girls or whatever. But later, we'll create a dictatorship, which will ban those things. So I don't know how to change that opinion. This has been a whole thing with Trump the whole time, right? That there's this sort of, we're going to drain the swamp, we're against the elites, go cause trouble in the streets. And it does look anti-authoritarian, even while it's tied to authoritarian politics. So I'm not sure how we change the public's perception of that. I think it is one of the issues that is worth thinking about how to do it. Sometimes I don't think anti-fascists or the left have a kind of long-term plan to think about these things, or even a structure for people to think together about these things out of small networks. So that, I think, is something worth pondering and worth pondering with other people.
Welcome to the future. Welcome to the future. Welcome to the future. Welcome to the future. My jetpack stolen. No debts I'm holding. We stay rolling even though it's mostly bad omens. Living on borrowed time and we know it. Let it go. Let's get to the place where we won't need it anymore. Too long, choking everybody that I know. Leviathan got you shook. It ain't nothing but a snake with a book. I don't need no Nazi to tell me the halls of the Capitol are empty. Politicians hiding under the desks, billion back east on the threat of a drone. I grew up, but fucking screw up. The generation before me grew without computers. motherfucker walked on the moon. Now the only ones talking space are tycoons. Nobody home, everybody on lock. 2020 was the year the calendar broke and time stopped. Do I run the clock has been the task. No one runs it until everyone is smashed. Welcome to the future. Welcome to this cruel out there in the streets. Who me? I'm just a tumor in the belly of the beast. Speaking of governable with it, make them uncomfortable with it. Hell freezes over, and over and over and over. I said hell freezes over, and then a new hell becomes the norm. I'm back but only one fake tooth, cybernetic being, all my senses Bluetooth. When I was a youth, here is what they told me, but Y2K, we'd only work 20 hours a week. I don't work, at least not for y'all. I do my homework, not for y'all. Thunderdome, we going leaderless, don't need no heroes. Bankrupt, politics, the world is a casino. I get that on me, I get that fuck you hands up. The ruling class don't own me. Entitled to whatever I can grasp, but ain't nobody own me. Earthquakes break the containment of desire. Planet Earth, the space between fires. The real, but controlled by liars. Paper tigers don't survive, no. Welcome to the future. Welcome to the future. Welcome to the future.
So after January 6th, groups like the Proud Boys began a campaign of local entrenchment, speaking of libertarian ideas, supporting things like banning certain books or pushing back against mass mandates, going to city council meetings and harassing people. Has this strategy been successful for them?
That's a good question too. I don't think it's been wildly successful. I think it will probably, sometimes these things, from what I've seen in the past, they're kind of a way that recuperate radical movements into more traditional politics, right? Like, if you want to influence a school board or get elected to a school board, that's a lot of work. Then you're on a school board and you got to do school board stuff, right? And then you probably don't want to be caught on video punching somebody in the face if you're a member of the school board. That's just not a good look. So it doesn't seem like it's hurt the movement. It may have, I mean, if the Proud Boys are around for a long time, which at this point it does look like they have some serious longevity, or the potential to a long period longevity. The potential seems to be there. Having these kinds of connections will help buoy their organization and not just being, as something more than just drunk young men, fighting in the streets or middle-aged men.
Middle-aged men.
Yeah, but the reputation is young men, even though in fact it's a lot of middle-aged men. So I don't know. It clearly hasn't been wildly successful, in terms of recruiting or something. I don't see any evidence of that. It hasn't been maybe such a drain as it might have been or might have seemed. If you do this kind of work though, I mean, you're going to end up blending in with other activists, with just regular Trumpists who are working on these issues. It becomes the same way radical leftists, want to work on a popular issue, like a really popular issue, where you end up being in a minority with a much bigger group of liberals and others, right? You sort of end up all on the same page in order to work together. And so that's a watering down, at least, of tactics. So, I mean, I think it will have some kind of recuperative effect, but that's a double-edged sword, because then the Proud Boys can make some of these groups more radical, even while the larger group makes the Proud Boys less radical. So it could have a bunch of different effects. I think right now there hasn't been it doesn't seem to have affected them in a big way, one way or the other.
Have you seen any examples of people pushing back on them using this strategy?
I have not been paying the kind of attention, that micro level attention, but in general, I'm going to say I think these sort of tactics are more successful in conservative areas and less successful in liberal areas. They're more likely to alienate people in liberal areas and be accepted in conservative areas. I think that's a rule of thumb with these kinds of groups, or for this kind of organizing, you know what I mean?
Again, switching gears, how much do you think state repression impacted groups like the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers? Like, now that we've got over a year since January 6th, like, has it really impacted these groups at all, or have they just kind of continued forward?
Well, I think they're two different circumstances. With the Oath Keepers, they've long been given a impressively long leash, considering how many times their leader, Stuart Rhodes, has called, for blood and fire and war, including in situations where people are armed. He was at the Oath Keepers, came to the Bundy Ranch, and were part of the armed groups there. Just wild rhetoric calling for blood, and nothing's ever happened to him. And the Oath Keepers, who, as people maybe don't remember, they're originally a non-armed membership-based, organization when they founded in 2009, and have over the years morphed into something more like a militia, right? And that's, been, in the last 5 or so years that this has happened. So I think after 1/6, because nothing had ever happened to them, and then after that, nothing happened until those arrests, very recently, we'll see it's a somewhat of a paper organization around Rhodes by all accounts. There's a rotating membership. They're not taken seriously within the militia movement. He's seen as a grifter, but he's always been able to recruit a fair number of people. Although we also need to think, like, there were, a dozen people, 15 Oath Keepers at the Capitol takeover. This isn't a large deployment. He has more people than that than he could call out. So I think if he goes down on charges, that organization is over. I mean, I think that organization is him. And if he gets out of it, then they'll be fine. His prestige could only increase from that. As for the Proud Boys, like I said before, they're impressively resilient. They've gone through a number of leaders, like Gavin McGinnis, who, it looked like a cult around, has gone away, and they haven't been impeded by this at all. Enrique Tarrio has engaged in conduct that I think even people in the organization think is reprehensible. That hasn't sunk them. There's been many arrests. That hasn't stopped them. So I don't think the 1/6 arrests are going to do I think there's up to 40 people who are in or associated with the Proud Boys. I'm not sure how many of these are associated. Have been arrested. I just don't think this is going to stop the organization. Unless these people are really all key organizers, which some of them clearly are. There might be, attrition over time. It's clear that some of the most violent, members of the group are going down, slowly, are going down on, sometimes on heavy charges. So, but I haven't seen it yet. So I don't think, in the end right now, 1/6 has not impacted the Proud Boys. Not from my view.
Historically, groups like the Proud Boys, they kind of flirt with kind of the patriot side and also the white nationalist side. Like, what's caused them to actually decline in organizing historically?
The moment passing and them burning out. I mean, I think because their group is so centered around aggressive street politics, they can get involved in community school board stuff or whatever, but that's not going to sustain the group. If all Proud Boys started going to school boards, it wouldn't be the Proud Boys anymore.
And they just do that to
a lot of
try
people
to
are going to
beat people
lose
up,
interest very quickly. I mean, it could morph into another thing entirely using the same name, and people will be like, "Oh, this actually started as a super militant group, and now they're school boardists or something." So I think the Proud Boys are in a sense, the militant vanguard of the Trumpist movement. And, I was I was expecting or hoping, I guess, when Trump was finally out of power, this movement would deflate. And it clearly hasn't, which is an interesting and worrying phenomena. I think part of the reason it hasn't is because it's taken over the GOP for all practical reasons. I thought there was going to be a split in the GOP, and in some kind of way there is, but not a real split. And the Trumpists seem to be driving out, the people who oppose them, like McCain. And so I think as long as the Trumpists, a vibrant grassroots Trumpist movement is around, the Proud Boys will continue to have the kind of position that they have. I mean, it could decline in numbers, but and they've positioned themselves really well, like as aggressive Trumpists with, I don't know if it's a foot in the white nationalist movement, but definitely a few toes, in it. And so they get to have a kind of plausible deniability at the same time, while, getting some of that aggressiveness and sheen from the white nationalists.
Well, let's turn now towards another group. Over the past year, we've seen increasing crossover between some Republicans and the Groypers. You mentioned there hasn't been a split in the GOP. It seems now, at least for some, Ryan Gosar, other people, association or flirtation with people like Nick Fuentes isn't a game-changing thing anymore. And in fact, it's, sort of like a badge of honor now that they refuse to cancel these people. What do you think that says about, the wider political moment that we're in?
It's another scary thing. It shows how far right the Republican Party has shifted. It's interesting to note that of the whole alt-right, there's of the white nationalist wing of the alt-right that really got all its fire under Trump. There's two remaining groups. One is Patriot Front, who are very, they separated themselves from Trump, and they're going on this like independent fascist organizing thing in a more traditional way, right? They're having marches. They're like, we're fascists, blah, blah, blah. We're not working with conservative groups. And then the other are the Groypers, who are an entryist project. Even though if you scratch the surface, I mean, they're just white, they're white nationalists, they're fairly traditional white nationalists. You have, Fuentes saying stuff like total Aryan victory. I think it shows I think their ability to draw support from members of Congress shows how far right, the Trumpists, are today. I think the Groypers have very successfully done what they wanted to do, was position themselves as the rightmost Trumpists, and maybe to help drag them into white nationalism. I don't know how much they're dragging them into white nationalism, but they surely have found a nice niche on the right wing of the Trumpist movement. And so they've been very successful in that way, and successful, as you said, in drawing some mainstream support. I don't know how much influence they've had on the larger Trumpist movement, if they've actually dragged it to the right, but they clearly have been able to get a lot of very young supporters. I mean, that's one of the more interesting thing about that movement, is how young it is.
How do you think that anti-fascists and broader movements should react to elected officials when they openly embrace, these white nationalist figures?
I mean, you can use traditional strategies. Obviously, these things are happening in extremely conservative districts. I know a lot of people don't want to do this, and I respect that people don't want to do it, but when you have these situations, it might be time to think about getting involved in electoral organizing, because otherwise you get stuck with a Republican who's playing footsie with the white nationalists. And, obviously if they're getting reelected, the opposition isn't being very effective against them. And there's only so much effect that demonstrations or street, community organizing can do. You end up hoping that the reformists, that in the Democratic Party can win an election, even though you're not helping them. So people have to make their choice in that way. But, I think you have to pursue traditional strategies. You have to help mobilize communities who are, most alienated from white nationalists, Jews and Muslims and people of color and feminists and stuff, and get these communities, engaged in opposition. I think people don't think a lot about politics, both electoral and not. Depends a lot about how much you can not just that people from your political who are political sympathizers or adherents are on your side, but how much you get them mobilized, right? And certain things mobilize people or mobilize them to oppose things. And I think we've all seen this. Some campaigns, get more traction than others. And when you have big demonstrations, suddenly you get, when we have big demonstrations, you suddenly see people who are politically sympathetic but not usually activists come out and join the movement. So, I think this is a time when you see Republicans getting in bed with white nationalists as a time that you can activate people who are sympathizers, but, so far fairly inert as political actors in the kind of demographics that you draw support from traditionally. And whether you want to channel that into an electoral arena or not, you don't have to do either. If you don't have to do what you don't want to do, but you should help mobilize those communities.
Yeah. Well, I think to your point, just how scary it is, I think we've kind of moved beyond this period where you even just exposing somebody's connection to, white nationalists. Like I remember when, Chris Kobach was exposed for having some Identity Europa people as staffers and, they were fired afterwards. And now there's somebody that's a Groyper, I think that's that's working for some GOP person. I think the Huffington Post just did an article about it. Mm-hmm. And they're we refuse to fire this person because we don't want to cancel him. So it just seems like we've entered into this period where they feel like they have enough backing from their base to just continue to associate with open white nationalists, and that's fine.
Yeah, that's how it's going down. It certainly looks like that. I think we need to look at other countries where they have deeply divided societies, where they have fascists and communists. In the old days, it was communists, like in Latin America in the 80s, you'd have fascists and communists in a community, and they would be mobilizing against each other, and you weren't going to be able to expose the other. It's not United States in the 50s where you could expose someone as being fascist linked, or the United States in the right. 80s or 90s where you could expose them as having links to white nationalists. So at some point you're going to have to out-organize them,
right.
Or and this is easier said than done, I think, particularly now, try to create splits amongst conservatives. But I think that maybe was more possible in the past than it is today. There are conservatives who don't want to get in bed with white nationalists. But as so many conservatives have just, made their peace with Trumpism, whether it's their cup of tea or not, it's successful. That I don't know how successful that strategy can be now.
Well, you brought up Patriot Front, and this kind of speaks to what we were just talking about in terms of splits. But what do you make of people like Jack Posobiec or publications like the Gateway Pundit, who have clear connections to the Groypers and other white nationalists, but have also pushed to label groups like Patriot Front as, quote, feds? What is the goal there?
Well, I think it's funny. I think it's an attempt to, right after Charlottesville, before Charlottesville, it was unclear whether the open white nationalist alt-right was going to be allowed into the legitimate conservative, Republican and conservative milieu. And there became basically a distinct decision that Richard Spencer and people like that were not going to be allowed, but alt-right people were going to be allowed, right? We saw this split happening in September 2017. And so I think the denouncing Patriot Front aren't useful to the Trumpists. How many people the Patriot Front have? 300. I don't even understand why they brand themselves with patriotic stuff, because it's not like you really got to go down to figure out they're fascists, right? As soon as you look at anything they do, they're fascists. They're very clearly fascist. So I'm not sure what the American flag stuff is, but I guess it's useful. They're successful for what they are. But what are 300 people to Trumpists? It's not a useful thing to the movement, and by denouncing them, and they've said that they don't support Trump, and so they're being thrown under the bus in a kind of way, right? They can be like, oh well, these are the white nationalists, the Groypers aren't, right?
state of the union is that there isn't one. If a house divided can't stand, we've been sitting, but sitting officials letting you starve and die. They say for a party, I say it's dogma to America's awful lie. Sniffing the party line, intoxicated from white. That fake superiority created by authority to convince the parts he's still one cast up. Cause at least you not black, and if at least you not that, then if you see and got mad that the elite eat on backs of your labor, you point at your neighbor instead of up to keep you off track. They told you your sins weren't sins, but beneath that hatred is shame. Your humanity was picked and sold with the cotton of slave. System is fucked, we benefit passively. White liberals and such make a social identity from giving a fuck, but that privilege they may acknowledge, they ain't giving it up. We ain't living it much. The ego's driving the car, and it just depends on where it got its license. How many of us really choose our own thoughts and vices? You don't get paid, but you're a walking advertisement. Made us all addicted to fame so that we work for free. Millions factless cause their schools ain't teach them how to find them. If they get to choose, they pick the ones that their wants align with. Can you track your opinion to its origin? If not, I then we move without intent. They profit when we not decisive. Rappers been lazily referencing the Matrix for years. Who knew algorithms would really dictate what we cheer? Too lazy to care, afraid to look inward. We live in our own noose for we live in our own truth. Fake tweets about how you love everyone. You won't even wear a mask to save somebody's grandmother. Entitled to the lies of freedom, you in denial. I seen this shit for a while, it's lethal, man, word to Dan Glover. You can't fake lightning, but you can plan thunder. Pay a racist brand before we pay attention. I sit in damn wonder. Yeah, and everyone talking generational wealth, but outside making money for ourselves. We won't give the next generation no help. May already be too late to save the fucking planet. If we don't stop playing, there won't be no more generations to help. We train people for survival of the fittest in traumatic conditions and sold them things that kill them. We made life into a gamble in the name of capitalism, then tried to hit the democracy switch when COVID hit and now it's destined to fail. You can't abuse populations, leave them destitute and vacant, and then ask them to care about anything but their next move. Our own nation to blame, so I get why we at the club. Still, I ain't say I'm not enraged, I want better from us. I just don't expect it. Trauma is cyclical, the most likely ones to neglect are the neglected. They have future selling you Molly Lean, Percocet, and you think for a check they need a scheme on vaccine injections? A lot of the soft bigotry of low expectations, a lot of fetishization, celebrating regressive themes in the name of progression. And when something truly powerful come, it's hesitation. And there's this fishy correlation between what's considered cool and what profits for corporations. Rappers streaming tens of mils considered not as poppin', cause on their next endeavor, no labor loan's an option. So vacancy across the culture, so when they say they do it for it, man, I gotta wonder. The only culture is validate wins and win equals money. Truths like my chest in 06 is beneath with a rugby. I don't even like talking this direct. I ain't no book report ass rapper, but I object to the marriage to greed and clout without heat and doubt of what winning means. Ask why we on different teams, we don't play the same sport. Started getting to some places I've been trying to go and looking around like, yo, this ain't what I came for. So if I gotta give up what's righteous to get it, you can keep it. Fuck a popular lie, I'd rather be a truthful secret. Herd immunity to truth and self-assessment. Truth is, if not for COVID, Trump would've won re-election in a landslide. So we evaded Armageddon for good old store brand depression. But if a leader more savvy and less sociopathic with true fascist aspirations come along, it's gonna be tragic. 74 million proved if the right rhetoric is used. We could end up on the wrong side of World War II too. And to defeat white supremacy, you gotta first want to defeat white supremacy. I don't think most of us really do. How many white mirror convos really bearing fruit? The only hope is that this moment in history looks the same in both timelines of what the end could be. Whether this the infection rising up and we fight and quell, or if it outscraps us and humanity just dies and fails. It was always gonna get worse before it got better. Racism was never gonna go quietly to the night. It never will, but I do believe that it along with greed could make its way out of our institutions so that all are free one day. I ain't say that it will, but today looks like today in both versions of the story, so gon' grab you a quill. It depends what we do. There's only one person the future starts and ends with, it's you.
Well, speaking of white nationalists, in the past month we've seen flare-ups from groups like the Goyim Defense League. There's been White Lives Matter protests. Patriot Front has also marched, like we said. The Groypers have tried to go out to like New York and do stuff around anti-vax. The NSM was out in the streets of Florida beating people up. So it seems like we've entered back into this period where neo-Nazi and white nationalist groups have sort of adapted their strategies in order to take the streets. Like they're doing stuff where they're not announcing it, or they're working with police to have like super like coordinated police protection. I'm just curious, how do you think movement should respond in this period? Like obviously people are already, but this is sort of like a new terrain we're entering in, where they're not sort of kind of like, hey, we're going to be at the town square on Tuesday.
Right.
They're sort of adapting.
Yeah, it's not the old strategy where you had 15 Nazis and 500 police and 5,000 counter demonstrators. That's happened for many decades. It's interesting to see these they're all little groups. They're very little, and they're not sophisticated, right? It's back to the Jews, blah, 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 which you didn't really see in the white nationalist alt-right. I mean, I guess you did with like Andrew Anglin or whatever, but there was some more subtlety to it. And I think as the white nationalist alt-right did burn out, I mean, I think that's over. And then the things that were alive from it have continued as their own thing, the Groypers and Patriot Front or whatever, because that sort of thing ended. This is just but it's still a lively moment for conservatives, right? They still have wind beneath their sails that this is what's come up to replace them. That I think if you really want to be an open Nazi and not work with the Trumpists, there's no reason to be sophisticated. There's no reason to think that you can blend in with others or want to blend in with others. I think there's some attempt to actually distinguish themselves from Trumpists or from the Groyper entryists, right? It's sort of like if you're radical, you should totally be radical. Why half-ass it, right? And so if you've chosen not to do an entryist thing, so that's what I think is going on. I mean, I think these groups can be combated or counter-organized against in the usual way, by isolating them. Even, with the Fed thing, I should go back to that, with Prosobiec or whatever, saying they're Feds. I think they know they're not Feds. They know very well they are, and they're just throwing them under the bus in an attempt to separate themselves from them. And so, Goyim Defense League, Trumpists aren't going to embrace this stuff. And they're easy enough to organize against them. Doing pop-ups and stuff, though, I mean, that's just what politics are going to be. This stuff was, I think, mostly pioneered by Casa Pound in Italy and the identitarians in the aughts. And so there's, this is well ensconced in fascist organizing techniques nowadays. Obviously, it was taken mostly from the left, but so be it. They're not very high on my radar of things to be worried about for me right now.
Well, just to kind of send us off, as there continues to be more crossover and coordination between the state and all of these autonomous far-right groupings and forces, how do you think that we can adapt our strategy?
I think we're definitely in a waiting period. I think we're waiting on three things maybe. One, we're waiting on the 1-6 charges and what's going to come out of that and how that's going to affect the right wing, the Trumpist movement. Two, we're waiting on the 2022 elections. And I think I would, advise people, even the most militant anarchists, to pay close attention to elections because they're very good barometers of political sentiment. There aren't very many people in the United States who don't vote because of a political thing. And so I pay very close attention to them because I feel like they're a good empirical barometer of what's going on and what's going on where, which far-right candidates can be elected, which white nationalists can be elected. So I think a lot of people and radical left organizing happens, it's in an ecosystem with liberal organizing. They don't exist in totally separate worlds. They have a relationship to each other. Issues are often the same in some general way, right? And so, liberals are going to react to the 2022 election, and that will affect, proper left-wing organizing. And then the third thing is, will Trump run? which it seems like he will. And what will that do? Will he be able to mobilize a lot of support like he did last time? Although I think that answer is yes, judging by what's happening inside the GOP. So I don't know. I mean, I think right now it's a moment of waiting. We do have breathing room right now. I do wish people would help progressives in especially more rural conservative areas that are under attack at school boards, even in libraries. A lot of progressives in these areas need help. They're very isolated, and I'm sure they would greatly appreciate help, and there needs to be more transfer of resources in a broad way, whether that's people or money or whatever, to help prop these people up and fight back attempts to take over school boards or ban books from libraries or whatever you have. Because that's where the right is most successful right now in a contested area. And the rest of it, I don't know. I think we should again, I'm not sure what the answer is. The soonest thing will be, I'm not sure if there's a time limit on the 1-6 committee or not, but on the results of that and on the results of the 2022 midterms, and then have a deep moment of self-reflection about, what's going to happen in the next 2 years and what can be done. I don't think progressives are very good. Left-leaning movements are very good at strategizing, much more than 6 months ahead of time. The conservatives are very good at that. The Christian right is excellent at having multi-decade programs. I don't think we're very good about having even a multi-year strategy. You see this very clearly with nonprofits who really don't think of anything beyond the next, funding cycle at all. But I think even broader and even with grassroots movements, there's not a whole lot of reflection about what do we do in the next 2 years or 4 years. So I think it's a good time to think about what we're going to do in the next 2 and 4 years.
Do you see another January 6th situation developing where there's this sort of like intentional kind of activation of, far right groups to basically fight for Trump or the GOP?
Not under Biden. I mean, like physical attempts, not under Biden. No, they're not going to allow it. I mean, that demonstration could have easily, if not been dispersed. It wasn't that many. It was like 2,000 people, right? Totally. I think. Actually, I can't remember. Several thousand. I mean, there's no reason that the police in D.C. should have allowed them to get into the Capitol or anywhere near the Capitol.
I think what's more scary, at least coming from like the Trumpists, is that they are actively taking measures to build up kind of like a bureaucratic state structure in order to not only curtail voting rights and stuff like that and like redistrict places like they just did in Georgia again, but actually put in their own electors to basically throw things their way.
Well, that's different than 1-6. I mean,
sure.
That's what I'm saying. Like, if there's a demonstration that's going to be able to have such effect again under Biden, no. Will Republicans, I mean, this is also a long-term strategy of Republicans, Trumpists aside, because they're so heavily based amongst the white population. I mean, this is really what's going down here. Their base is so heavy amongst white people, and white people are still a super majority in the U.S. As the demographics change in the U.S., they're doing everything they can to keep districts white, and even as they're white conservatives are, such a shrinking minority, they're playing hardball to do this, and Democrats are not playing hardball back. So, yeah, I believe that they, can, through hook and crook, continue to win elections for the foreseeable future. Especially if they, have the Trumpists control the party, because part of that is that, there's no unethical measure. There's no measure that the party's going to take that the base will be like, well, that's totally unethical and we're not going to do that. You know what I mean? Like, that's been one of the big changes that, there are principled conservatives, and now they're a minority in the party, and so you can't appeal to the principles, to a sort of ethical principle of democracy in Republicans anymore. So, underhanded tactics, lies, propaganda, all fine now. And so, yeah, they're going to continue to try to use these tactics to ensure that they will win elections through all these different things, redistricting and stopping people from voting and such.
You're listening to It's Going Down, part of the Channel Zero Anarchist Podcast Network. Follow us online at itsgoingdown.org and on Twitter at IGD_news. If you like and appreciate this podcast, go to itsgoingdown.org/shop and give us a one-time donation. Sign up to donate monthly or donate through Bitcoin. Again, that's itsgoingdown.org/shop to support. And now, back to the show.
Do you think that antifaism will continue to be sort of like this thing that brings in these big returns for the right, like even just like the Fox News kind of MAGA crowd, or do you think that they'll pivot and kind of go after other stuff? It seems like there's been sort of a shift to focus more on stuff like critical race theory as sort of Antifa has gotten out of the news, or do you think that's a boogeyman that can come back whenever they needed to?
I think it can come back whenever they need it to, but I also think like people need to be in the streets. Like as you said, the pivot is almost from Black Lives Matter to critical race theory, right? And the thing is, like, Black Lives Matter was in the streets, Antifa was, was in the streets. And if they're not in the news, I mean, right wingers especially have such a short attention span, right? Not the people in the think tanks and stuff, they have a long attention span, but the activists, they're so driven by these emotional things and just like blah, 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 like it's got to be the next minute, push the button. If things are invisible, you can't push the button. Can they come back? Can the anti-Antifa rhetoric come back? Sure, it'll come back immediately as soon as the Antifa is back in the news. But is it useful right now? No, it's not useful. Fox News isn't banging the drum about how terrible Antifa is, and so there's no point to have this dialogue or these conspiracy theories against that movement. But yes, it could come back at any time.
Or it could like turn into another brand or something like that, I guess.
Sure. Well, people have to know the anti-Antifa stuff is just anti-communist stuff.
Yeah.
It's switched over. It's the same narrative they've used. That thing's been around for like 100 years. You'll see or even older, right? I mean, you'll see anti-Bolshevik stuff from as soon as the revolution happened in 1917, but there was anti-socialist stuff before then. So that's just a very, very old thing for the far right. They can just keep reusing it and recycling it.
Well, anything else you want to talk about before we let you go?
I think we covered a lot of ground. I mean, I think people should, while we have this breather moment, I feel like we definitely have a breather moment, to think about what you will do next as an activist, and maybe even sit down with a planner. What are you going to do? What are your goals for the election in 2022? For a year after that, and then for what's going to happen in 2024, starting, with the primaries. I'm sure Trump is going to run and win, but there'll still be a primary, and that will still motivate the base. Like, what you think you're going to do at each moment, what you think your resources are, who you think your allies are, at which level do you want to intervene. The elections are going to happen anyway, and people are going to be mobilized on the right and left around the elections. You don't have to do that, but you will doing your organizing in that context. Where is it that you're going to intervene? How are you going to intervene? And maybe a little bit about what happens if Trump wins in 2024. Like what steps will at least happen at the beginning of that. I think people should sit down with their friends, think about these things, game out, and start to game out possibilities and talk about, you don't have to make concrete plans, but think about what you're going to do or what you could do or what your options are.
Yeah, for sure.
I think that'd be a useful thing while we have a moment, while nothing is burning as it did, for 4 years, every week or every month under Trump, something new got lit on fire. Now would be a good time for that.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me as always.
This has been the It's Going Down podcast. Check itsgoingdown.org for daily updates, columns, action reports, and news. Go to itsgoingdown.org/shop to support us and follow us on all social media platforms. IGD, your daily resource for insurgent proletarian life.